All right. Okay, so one of the things that we could have gone over today was how to do a word search in the book. We're going to kind of do the second part of that, but honestly, I'd rather focus on the discussion video, the crash course video, some Jeopardy, because we really haven't had a chance to play a lot of Jeopardy, so we want to do that. And then at the end of the class, I'll probably have to turn the camera off for this because of copyright. I do want to watch a scene from John Adams. It's episode 3 or 4, and it's a really good one. Let her in. It's a really good episode because the scene that I'm going to show you is where John Adams actually meets King George III after the Revolutionary War. So it's actually between Revolutionary and between War of 1812. It is an excellently acted out scene. You see the interaction between King George III. He's very proper. He's kind of looking down at Adams, and Adams comes in all humble. And you see this level just kind of change, you know, the distance between the king who starts standing but then finishes sitting, and Adams who's the one who's actually, it's just really good. Very historically accurate to the time. All right, so first thing we're going to do while we're waiting for the projector to set up is, I already asked this before, but how did everyone feel about the papers in general? Good?
Pretty good.
Pretty good. Yeah. So, in case you kids across the camera there are wondering, I will be grading papers every day, so the way it's going to work is you're just going to get some trickling grades. So some of you may get a grade, some of you may not, all on the same day. So it's going to be like a 2-week thing. You will be getting your grades in. If you are concerned about a grade or you do not see a grade in 2 weeks, please email me. Another thing some of you need to do, and I'm not going to name names, but there's at least 4 of you across all the campuses that they submitted the paper, but it didn't submit all the way. You did the click once thing and it says file not submitted. So I technically have it, but I need to see the submission. I'll try to send you an email, but just if I were you, I'd be on the safe side to look it up. The way to tell is it will literally say submitted fully. It'll be in green, submitted, you should see it. If you see a grayed out, like not fully submitted, you need to let me know. I can open it up for you because I realize that you did mean to turn it in. It won't be a late grade, but just get on to me about that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is watch a crash course on the War of 1812, which is kind of an odd war for us because arguably it really didn't do anything. So it's probably one of the most pointless, useless wars that we ever had. We did gain a little of territory out of it, but arguably we might have gained that anyway, and in the long run, this is one of those wars that by many is kind of deemed like a why did we do this again? One big thing that did come out of it was Andrew Jackson. You probably heard of him. President, kind of a rough dude, interesting historical figure. But I will pause at moments that I think are valid, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So here we go. Oh, I should probably turn the lights off. So. Also, I see we have a couple sit-ins today for the college class. Welcome. And your name is? Chloe, and your name is?
Marissa.
Marissa, Chloe. I'll try to remember.
For the course of U.S. history, and today we're going to talk about what America's best at. War. Mr. Green, the United States has actually only declared war 5 times in the last 230 years. Oh, me from the past, you sniveling literalist. Well, today we're going to talk about America's first declared war, the War of 1812, so-called because historians are terrible at naming things. I mean, they could have called it the Revolutionary War Part 2, or the Canadian Cataclysm, or the War to Facilitate Future Wars. But no, they just named it after the year it started. I know this disappoints the military historians among you, but as usual, we're going to spend more time talking about the causes and effects of the war than the actual, killing parts, because ultimately, it's the ambiguity of the War of 1812 that makes it so interesting. The reason most often given for the War of 1812 was the British impressment of American sailors, whereby American sailors would be kidnapped and basically forced into British servitude. This disrupted American shipping. It also seems like a reasonably obvious violation of American sovereignty, but it's a little more complicated than that. First of all, there were many thousands of British sailors working aboard American ships, so many of the sailors that the British captured were in fact British. Which gets to the larger point that citizenship at the time was a pretty slippery concept, especially on the high seas. Papers were often forged, and many sailors identified their supposed Americanness through tattoos of eagles and flags. And there were several reasons why a British sailor might want to become or pretend to be an American, including that the Brits at the time were fighting Napoleon in what historians, in their infinite creativity, called the Napoleonic Wars. And on that topic, Britain disrupt American shipping to France and to get new British sailors to strengthen their war effort, which was annoying to the Americans on a couple levels, especially the French-loving Republicans.
All right, so pause there. Why would the Americans probably be a bit distressed that the British are kind of still roughing up the French a bit?
Because the French helped them during the war.
That's right. I mean, in this regard, the French had actually helped us win the war with their navy, with their military, and on top of that, we have a trade set with both France and England, and I mean that's money, And so if those two are fighting, we're not making a lot of money, and so for us as Americans, it was very much a problem. And we were kind of getting ticked with Britain because Britain was in an unending war. It was a very long war between France. They'd been fighting it even before, going back to the French and Indian War. They're still fighting this war with the French now in 1812, which is like 50 years later. So,
which is a phrase that you don't hear very often anymore. Another reason often given for the war was America's crazy conspiratorial Anglophobia. Everything in a widespread rumor that British agents were buying up Connecticut sheep in order to sabotage the textile industry, lest you worry that America's fascination with conspiracy theories is new. So those pushing for war were known as war hawks, and the most famous among them was Kentucky's Henry Clay. They took the impressment of sailors as an affront to American national honor, but they also complained that Britain's actions were an affront to free trade, by which they meant America's ability to trade with Europeans other than Great Britain. And to be fair, the British were trying to regulate American trade. They even passed the Orders in Council, which required American ships to dock in Britain and pay tax before trading with other European nations. Britain, we were an independent nation. You can't do that kind of stuff. We have a special relationship. It's not that special. But the problem with saying this caused the war is that the orders had been in effect for 5 years before the war started, and they were rescinded in 1812 before the U.S. declared war, although admittedly we didn't know about it because it didn't reach us until after we declared war. There was no Twitter. Another reason for the war was Canada. That's right, Canada. Americans wanted you, and who can blame them with your excellent healthcare and your hockey and your first-rate national anthem? Stan, this is fun, but enough with the hashtag 1812 problems. According to Virginia Congressman John Rudolph, agrarian cupidity, not maritime rights, urges the war. We have heard but one word: Canada. Canada. Canada! I'm not here to criticize you, John Randolph, but that's actually 3 words. Now, some historians disagree with this, but the relentless pursuit of new land certainly fits in with the Jeffersonian model of an agrarian republic. And there's another factor that figured into America's decision to go to war: expansion into territory controlled by Native Americans. So, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I try to guess the author of the mystery document. Usually I'm wrong and I get shocked. Alright, let's see what we got here. You want, by your distinctions of Indian tribes and allotting to each a particular tract of land, to make them to war with each other. You never see an Indian come and endeavor to make the white people do so. It's Tecumseh, drop the mic! Is something that I would do, except that the mic is actually attached to my shirt, so there's no drama in this. Clearly Native American criticism of white people, and I happen to know that that particular one comes from Tecumseh, and I don't get shot today!
So we're going to pause on this too, because we're actually going to be getting into the discussion of Native American, basically pushing the Native Americans out, the Cherokee and Western expansion. So what is one problem when you discover boundless ends of land?
Everybody wants to go towards it.
Everybody wants to go for it. And really, to be fair, a lot of Americans at the time did not really acknowledge Indian sovereignty, with slight good reason, because the Indians didn't really acknowledge sovereignty of their own land. Really, Indians were more occupants, and they just lived in the land. They didn't think of it as like a boundary line. They didn't have boundaries like, this is our property and it's private. Now, that was different. In Europe, Britain, France even, you had land lots. You owned a certain amount of land, and that was just how that culture worked. So when they came over here, they had the same mindset. It's okay, we have to establish, you have this plot of land, you have that plot of land. One form of that, actually, in Georgia and several other states, took the form of land lotteries, where they would actually divide the land up into squares of, I think it was 40 acres or 160 acres here in Georgia, and they would have like this wooden wheel. And literally, without even checking with the natives or anything, they would spin this wheel, you get a land plot, and that was your land, and you had 10 years to pay off that land. Didn't matter who lived on it, it was yours now, according to the government. So this is kind of one of the major problems that comes with, say, the British or the English mindset of land ownership, because why did the natives get along with the French better? Does anyone?
The French allowed them to keep their land.
Well, that, and the France was not coming over in huge bulks of colonists. They were coming over to basically live off the land with the natives. And it was kind of like, we can make money through fur trap and other stuff. They didn't need big plots of land. They just worked with the natives and made their money through that. England, on the other hand, is coming over and saying, no, this is our land. You have to move out of it. And this is a major problem, especially when certain aspects, other additions like gold come into the mix. And a lot of people don't know that we actually had gold here in Georgia, big time. Arguably, we have more gold than over in California, true story. Do you have a question?
Well, I was actually saying that on our road before anyone lived there, Indians, it's Cherokee Gold Trail. You used to find gold all in the creeks and.
Yep, and the crazy thing is you still can. There's still gold there. But yeah, the Cherokee occupied this land. Now I will also say, and a lot of people don't know about this, the Creek tribe actually occupied the Georgia land before the Cherokee did. Then the Cherokee came from the north. I think they were part of the, which Indian nation? It might have been derivative of Iroquois. I'd have to look it up. But they came from the north and actually pushed the Creek out and reestablished here before the colonists even came here. And then we came, and not only did we discover land, but we also discovered gold. I think it was 1829 when we discovered gold. And when that happened, that just heightened that desire for us to push the natives out. And we actually arrived to that event, which I think I mentioned before, 1835, the Treaty of New Echota, where a certain number of Cherokee individuals actually signed away the land to the American government. And with that said, we kicked them out. It was like literally just a couple years later, we're like, nope, you're gone. So a lot of this had to do with this tie for American obsession, which came from Britain, with the idea of having to establish land boundaries. They wanted more and more as it went on. So.
Surprised that Americans were continuing to push westward into territory where Indians were living. I mean, this was a big reason for the Louisiana Purchase, after all. At the beginning of the war, more than 400,000 settlers had moved into territories west of the original 13 colonies, and they outnumbered American Indians by a significant margin. Some native groups responded with a measure of assimilation. Cherokees like John Ross wanted to become more civilized, that is, more white and farmery, and some of them did even adopt such civilized.
And just to pause there, so John Ross was actually the principal chief of the Cherokee Nations during the time of the Trail of Tears. Another one to look up, and you can actually go to his house today in Georgia, is Chief Van. There's a place called, I think it's in Chatsworth or something, called the Chief Van House. And he was, a lot of Cherokees tried to assimilate into white culture because they felt like by doing so, they belong and they'd be able to work with the white culture. And at the time, it didn't work in a lot of ways because, quite frankly, we still wanted the land. It was like, yeah, that's great. I'm glad you're doing our thing. Get out. So John Ross and Chief Van were among them. They would actually have their houses built like Victorian-style brick mansions. I mean, they were really beautiful, gorgeous, and looked very much like a colonial house of the day. So some tribes did not assimilate at all. They wanted nothing to do with that. They wanted to, some voluntarily moved out, like we're gone, we don't want to deal with this. Some tried to fight back. So, and it all depended on the tribe.
Practices as written languages and slavery, the most civilized practice of all. People are always like, why are we more celebratory of American history? Well, why isn't there more to celebrate? But other Indians wanted to resist. The best known of these were the aforementioned Tecumseh and his brother Tenscombe. Stan, can you just put on the screen? Yes, let's just enjoy looking at that. Right, that's just for all you visual learners. So he was also known as the Prophet because of his religious teachings and also because of the pronunciation issues. The Prophet encouraged Indians, especially those living in and around the settlement of Prophetstown, to abandon the ways of the whites, primarily in the form of alcohol and manufactured consumer goods. So stop drinking alcohol and eating refined sugars. This guy sounds like my doctor. Tecumseh was more militant, attempting to revive Neolman's idea of pan-Indianism and actively resisting white settlement. As he put it, sell a country, why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children?
Okay, and so to pause about something that Tecumseh said, this again reflects the Native American idea of what land was. It wasn't something to possess, it wasn't a boundary. It was simply something you lived as a part of. It was just a part of you, you were a part of it. And you couldn't really own it or say, well, this is mine. It was for literally everybody. And so had the settlers come in and said, we just want to live with you, live peacefully, we'll help you out, you'll help us out, use that reciprocity thing, it might have been a very different history altogether. But unfortunately, two completely different cultures and mindsets clashed.
The Americans responded to this reasonable criticism in the traditional manner, with guns. William Henry Harrison destroyed the native settlement at Prophetstown in what would become known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. He would later ride that fame all the way to the presidency in 1840, and then, spoiler alert, he would give the longest inauguration address US ever catch a cold and die 40 days later. Let that be a lesson to you American politicians. Long speeches, fatal. So I just painted a pretty negative picture of the Americans' treatment of the Indians because it was awful, but I haven't mentioned how this relates to the War of 1812. The Americans were receiving reports that the British were encouraging Tecumseh, which they probably were. And the important thing to remember here is that the War of 1812, like the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, was also a war against Indians. And as in those other two wars, the Indians were the biggest losers. And not in the cool way of the biggest loser where like Trainer Bob helps you lose weight, but in the really sad way where your entire civilization gets John C. Calhoun. So the War of 1812 was the first time that the United States declared war on anybody. It was also the smallest margin of a declaration of war vote, 79 to 49 in the House and 19 to 13 in the Senate. Northern states, which relied on trade a lot, didn't want to go to war, while southern and western states, which were more agrarian and wanted expansion to get land for farming and slavery, did. The closeness of the vote reflects a profound ambivalence about the war. As Henry Adams wrote, many nations have gone to war in pure gaiety of the heart, but perhaps the United States were the first to force themselves into a war they dreaded, in the hope that the war itself might create the spirit they lacked. Don't worry, Henry Adams, in the future we're going to get pretty gaiety of heartish about war. Anyway, as an actual war, the War of 1812 was something of a farce. Let's go to the thought bubble. The U.S. Army numbered 10 to 12,000, and its officers were sunk into either sloth, ignorance, or habits of intemperate drinking. The U.S. Navy had 17 ships. Great Britain had 1,000. Also, America had very little money. Britain collected 40 times more tax revenue than the U.S. But Britain was busy fighting Napoleon, which is why they didn't really start kicking America's butt until 1814, after Napoleon was defeated. Napoleon's defeat was also the end of the practice of impressment, since Britain didn't need so many sabers anymore. Initially, much of the war consisted of America's attempts to take Canada, which any map will show you went smashingly. Americans were confident that the Canadians would rush to join the U.S. When marching from Detroit, General William Hall informed the Canadians that, quote, "You will be emancipated from tyranny and oppression and restored to the dignified station of free men." And the Canadians were like, yeah, we're okay, actually. And so the British...
I kind of love that, because if you look at that expression before that, he basically demanded that they would get their freedom. Like, you will get your freedom and like it. It's like, kind of defeats the whole point of freedom, you know, if you're demanding it. But another thing to talk about here is, keep in mind, what is one of the reasons that we won the Revolutionary War? You could say won, or at the very least, stalled out.
Because the French came and helped us.
The French came and helped us, but also, was Britain really putting their full might against us?
No.
No. In fact, Johnson actually writes about in his book, he actually discusses the generals they sent over to deal with us, they weren't even the best generals. They were kind of the subpar or mediocre, like, yeah, they can fight and whatever. So Britain wasn't trying extremely hard to keep the colonies. Now, they wanted to because it was an embarrassment, because theoretically it was an investment, but really it was costing them more money than anything. So you could argue the British weren't trying very hard, and it wasn't exceedingly important. It was not priority number one. So all we had to do was hold out. Let's just basically say, we don't want to be with you anymore. We're going to keep fighting and keep fighting. So Britain basically said, okay, fine, it's just not worth keeping right now. It's not worth worrying about. In the War of 1812, it's a little bit different. We're taking on not the full might, but a pretty significant chunk of the might of the British Empire. And the simple fact is, we're just not ready for it. That's just how it is. So.
Ship Canada, with their Indian allies, went ahead and captured Detroit and then forced Hull's surrender. America's lack of success in Canada was primarily attributable to terrible strategy. They might have succeeded if they'd taken Montreal, but they didn't want to march through northern New York because it was full of Federalists who were opposed to the war. Instead, they concentrated on the west, that is the area around Detroit, where fighting went back and forth. The British found much more success, even seizing Washington, D.C. and burning the White House. In the course of the battle, British Admiral George Cockburn, overseeing the destruction of a newspaper printing house, told the forces that took the city, "Be sure that all the C's are destroyed so that the rascals cannot any longer abuse my name." It's hard out there for a Cockburn.
That's pretty awkward.
Given these problems, it's amazing there were any American successes, but there were. The battleship USS Constitution broke the myth of British naval invincibility when cannonballs bounced.
True story, you can actually still see this ship. There's also a cool movie called Master and Commander of the Far Side of the World. It's with Russell Crowe. And it's based off this ship because the enemy ship in that movie is, quote, a French ship called the Acheron. And it was actually the U.S. Constitution. This ship was the top of the line in terms of technology. Nothing had ever been made like it. And if I remember correctly, the way it was made, it was most cannons could penetrate like a certain type of oak. That was what most ships were made of. But the Americans, it was actually made by the Irish, it was designed by Irishmen, but the Americans put like a white layer of oak behind a different oak, followed by another white layer of oak. So essentially, the reinforcement of it almost made it like iron. So cannons would actually bounce off this thing, and it was a tank. To this day, it still stands. You can actually go see it. But yeah, it was a really neat movie because they made the French the enemy when in reality it was the Americans that were actually haunting the seas with this phantom ship that was like so unbeatable, and you never knew it was going to come up on you. So yeah, that's a really cool ship.
Dauphin and earned it the nickname Old Ironsides. Oliver Hazard Perry defeated a British fleet in, of all places, Lake Erie. At the Battle of the Thames, William Henry Harrison defeated Tecumseh, and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend showed one of the reasons why Indians were defeated when Andrew Jackson played one group of Creeks against another group of Creeks and Cherokees. 800 Indians were killed in that battle. And speaking of Jackson, the most notable American victory of the war was the Battle of New Orleans, which catapulted him to prominence. He lost only 71 men while inflicting 2,036 British casualties. Of course, the most memorable thing about the battle was that it took place 2 weeks after the peace treaty ending the war had been signed, but
yeah,
hey.
So that's a fun story. It was probably one of the most successful American battles in U.S. history. However, the war was technically over. So it's this happened in the Civil War too. Like even after the signing of the surrender at Appomattox, there were still battles that were fought after that. We kind of have a history of doing that. Americans really like wars, so even when the war's over, we're like, can we fight just a little bit longer?
That's not Jackson's fault. Again, no Twitter, hashtag 1815 problems. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, proved just how necessary the war had been. Not at all. No territory changed hands when negotiations started in August 1814. The British asked for northern Maine, demilitarization of the Great Lakes, and some territory to create an independent nation for the Indians in the Northwest. But none of that happened. Not because the U.S. was in a particularly good negotiating position, but because it would have been awkward for Great Britain to carve out pieces of the U.S. and then tell Russia and Prussia that they couldn't take pieces of Europe for themselves to celebrate their victory in the Napoleonic Wars. There were no provisions in the treaty about impressment or free trade, and basically the treaty returned everything to the status quo. So neither the U.S. nor Britain actually won, but the Indians, who suffered significant casualties and gave up even more territory, definitely lost. So with a treaty like that, the war must have had a negligible impact on American history, right? Except no, the War of 1812 confirmed that the U.S. would exist. Britain would never invade America.
So what he's saying there is that there was a chance that Britain could have wiped us out, and essentially reestablish their dominance in the colonies. The one successful thing you could say we really did in this war is the fact that we kept our boundaries up. We did manage to push the British back again. And so even though we didn't really win, it was more of a stalemate, we did establish we are a nation. We are officially a nation that can theoretically threaten Britain. That's great, I guess. But yeah, otherwise, when you think about the War of 1812, it really was one of the most pointless wars in our history. It just didn't get us anywhere.
One, the U.S. were good customers, and Great Britain was happy to let them trade as long as that trade wasn't helping a French dictator. The war launched Andrew Jackson's career and solidified the settlement and conquest of land east of the Mississippi River, and our lack of success in Canada reinforced Canadian nationalism while also ensuring that instead of becoming one great nation, we would forever be Canada's pants. The war also spelled the end of the Federalist Party, which tried in 1815 with the Hartford Convention to change the Constitution. In retrospect, the Hartford Convention proposals actually looked pretty reasonable. They wanted to eliminate the clause wherein black people were counted as 3/5 of a human and require a 2/3 congressional majority to declare war. But because they had their convention right before Jackson's victory at New Orleans, they only came off looking unpatriotic and out of touch, as the elite so often do. It's hard to argue that Americans really won the War of 1812, but we felt like we won, and nothing unleashes national pride like war winning. The nationalistic fervor that emerged in the early 19th century was, like most things, good news for some and bad news for others. But what's important to remember, regardless of whether you're an American, is that after 1812, the United States saw itself not just as an independent nation, but as a big player on the world stage. For better and for worse, that's a gig we've held on to, and no matter how you feel about America's international interventions, you need to remember, it didn't begin in Afghanistan or even Europe. It started with freaking Canada. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course.
And what he's alluding to there is not only do we have a history of, shall we say, getting into warfare, we have a history of intervening because we are America. And so usually we try to find excuses to get ourselves into a war that we probably have no business being in. One of them is Vietnam, and we won't be studying in this class, but if you ever studied the Vietnam War, or some people say the Vietnam conflict, it was arguably a war we could have stayed out of. And we were kind of like, no, they kicked France's butt and they might spread, so we should get over there. Yeah, it was not a good one. So, all right, we're gonna do this YouTube discussion about the Trail of Tears, and then we'll discuss it a bit. It's a shorter video, so we can actually turn the lights on after this and actually have some discussion here.
Well, the Cherokees from Georgia took several years. Some people left voluntarily for Indian Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma. But most Cherokees waited, hoping somehow to keep possession of their land. What happened to them is one of the darkest chapters in the history of Georgia. It is called the Trail of Tears. In 1838, United States soldiers were sent to round up the Cherokees and move them across the Mississippi River to Indian Territory. General Winfield Scott was in command. Cherokees.
So he was actually the one in command. He was under Martin Van Buren. A lot of people attribute Jackson to being the one who actually officiated the Trail of Tears. It was not. It was Martin Van Buren. Granted, Jackson did plenty to get it going, but the thing about Winfield Scott is he was positioned in Georgia at the time, and I think it was at this time he was said to be so fat that he couldn't get on his horse. Like, they literally had to get men to lift him up onto his horse. He had just gotten, but to be fair again to this man, he actually didn't want to do this. By all accounts that I've read and that I've studied, he actually did not want to remove the Cherokee, he did not want to do the Trail of Tears, but he was a general, so what does he have to do?
Obey the government.
He's got to obey the government, he's got to obey orders.
The President of the United States has sent me with a powerful army because you, in obedience, to join that part of your people who are already established in prosperity on the other side of the Mississippi.
And to those who might fight back, he warned.
Think of this, my Cherokee brethren. I am a warrior and have been present at many a scene of slaughter, but spare me, I beseech you, the horror of witnessing the destruction of the Cherokees.
When the soldiers arrived, Mavis Deering's grandmother was there and told her what happened.
She said that the soldiers came and said, it's time for you to go. So they were only allowed to leave with the clothing they had on their backs. They couldn't take anything with them on this trip. And she said that after they had walked a good part of the day, they were going uphill, that they looked back and they could see their homes down the valley. And she said that they could see their animals standing in the yard, see their homes. So it was a sad experience, a traumatic experience for all of them.
For Ramona Bear Taylor, the words to describe that time come slowly and painfully.
There was so much, I guess, harsh treatment that was done to my people. Were forced out of their homelands and put into stockades.
After they were rounded up, the Cherokees were held in stockades that were like concentration camps. And then they began to march west. Some took a river.
So let me pause here. What's another group of people that you can think of that this was done to them?
The Jews.
The Jews, yeah. So this happened several times in Jewish culture, with the Russians, with the Germans, and so on. And we'd love to be able to say as Americans, oh, we never participated in anything like that. We would never do that. We fought a whole war about, over World War II. Well, it wasn't just that, but you get what I'm saying. And yet, we look back at our history, and yeah, we did do that. In fact, we didn't just do it to the Native Americans, we also did it to the Japanese during World War II. But it's pretty rough sometimes. We love to think of America as this perfect nation. It's just like it represents the best of freedom. But no matter what you think about in history, when it comes to a conquering people or a people that's looking to expand, this sort of thing often happens. And the ultimate losers, as he was saying in the video, is the Native Americans, even though they actually helped us in some of our wars. And we still kicked them out.
I have a question.
Yes.
What was the dates of the Trail of Tears?
Dates of the Trail of Tears was 1838 to, it was over like 4 years at least, because it was a progressionary thing. Really, you could argue it was from 1820 something to like 1840 something in terms of the length that it took. Because the actual beginning of the removal of Native Americans and the suggestion of it actually goes back to Jefferson when he was a president. He had to address that question, and he was able to move it forward a little bit, kind of like the slavery question. They kept moving it down the line. They didn't want to address it. But the official year started 1838, and I'm trying to remember the exact number of years it went on, but it continued for a while. It wasn't just an easy, quick move. Again, you can see this, like we say the Trail of Tears, but this is just like an idea. Starting here, and we got Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama. There were multiple states it started out of, and multiple routes that were taken to ultimately end in Oklahoma. And there are still like different museums all along these trails that you can go to, and it'll talk to you about that section. There's a place, it's here up in North Georgia by the mountains, where like one of the main trails started, and you can actually go there and look at it. And I think you can still hike the trail technically. It's not really a real trail, but you can hike that area. It's right next to the Appalachians. But yeah.
But most traveled by land, almost 1,000 miles to Indian Territory, to what we now call Oklahoma. It was a long, difficult journey, especially for the very old and the very young.
If there was a woman that had a baby, and she was carrying a baby that died, there was illness along the way, and if the baby died, she would have to carry it the rest of the day. They didn't allow her to stop to bury it. But at night, my grandmother said that you could hear people digging graves every night, and they would bury the people that had died along the way, and then they would get to bury these babies. And that since it was October when they started, and it got to be winter along the way, that their feet, the moccasins were up, and then because of the ice on the ground and snow, that their feet would freeze and burst and leave bloody footprints all along the way.
And frostbite.
As the journey continued, there were a number of people who died from exposure, from starvation, from lack of medical attention. It was a miserable time to be alive. The people were completely without hope. But it was also said that the medicine people were the people who were able to keep the spirit up of the people as they moved along.
They sang this song on the journey west, asking for God's protection through the dark days and long nights. In English, it's called Guide Me, Jehovah, or simply the Trail of Tears song. It took nearly 4 months to reach Indian Territory. 15,000 people started out. 4,000 over 1 quarter died on the trip. They died of the cold, of starvation, of disease, and perhaps some died of a broken heart. But they are not forgotten, and in Oklahoma, both the Cherokee and the Creek nations survived.
To find that it was only 4 generations ago that we remember their names, and that we honor them, and that we named our children names that these people had when they were still here in Georgia and Alabama. So those names live on. We never forgot any of that.
They say that the eternal flame or the sacred fire that our people have, as long as the fire burns, the Cherokee people will survive, and that fire is still burning today.
Another sad thing about this with the Cherokee is that we had actually learned a lot from them, mainly in agriculture. We actually still use some of their base methods today. Obviously, we modernized farming, but at the time, they taught us several techniques, including seasonal farming that was like crop rotations, that we learned from them. So really, a lot of the reason we survived and flourished was because of the stuff that the Cherokee taught us. And then our response was to essentially kick them out. Now, I will also say, and I mentioned this before, and this doesn't justify what was done to the Cherokee, but this just goes to show you that history is never just black and white. The Cherokee also arguably did the exact same thing to the Creek people. The Creek had been here before the Cherokee. and the Cherokee came in and pushed them out. So this is kind of a sad cycle in history. We see one group of people wants what another group of people has, and they will do whatever it takes to get it. Obviously, they did not do it in the same numbers that we did it, because we had so many people and we were so numerous in the expansion. But I think it's always important to mention that, because we often think of the Cherokee as only victims, and in this regard they were. But as a people, they had their own crimes that they had committed, just as you typically see with any people. Did you have another question? Yeah.
Okay, well, silly question. So isn't it true that before they started the hiking on the trail too, so we're supposed to take a boat down there, but the river dried up? Because I did an essay on this, and I was reading about it, how on several times I'd seen on researching on and on, is that they were actually planning on taking a boat down a river instead, but the river dried up, so instead they hiked it.
It's possible, you know, I really don't know the answer to that one. I've not personally heard of that. I do know that there were some water routes that were taken, but they were very short. Some of them were actually moved through the swamps, because there were the Seminole tribe, which was actually a hybrid. There was like the Cherokee and some other tribe that blended together, and they were called the Seminoles. They were in Florida, and they were moved out. Some of them stayed, some of them moved out, and they had to go through the swamp areas. You know, like you can still go to Okefenokee in Georgia, and that's still there. So I don't know of like a full river that went from Georgia all the way to Oklahoma. Never heard of a river like that.
Not all the way there, but like for most of the way. They said something about taking down a river, or taking a river to, I'm pretty sure it was Oklahoma, I'm not sure where, but it was going to just take them out of this land, that the river dried up.
It's very possible. Like I said, I don't remember that. It would have made more sense if they were going to do that, to just take the Gulf and stay along the Gulf. But I'm not sure. I do know this much, that in regards to like how they were moved, there wasn't so much of a concern of that. It was kind of just get them out. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a tragedy is, if they were going to do this, they could have done this in a more humane way. I know that sounds weird, because how do you humanely kick people out? You don't. But you could have been nicer about it. And what they were just saying here is very accurate. They did not care who died along the way, or what the conditions were. So again, you can imagine what these people went through. And there have been several examples of this in history. The Jews went through this. The Chinese went through this when Japan fought them. I'm trying to think of the name of the trail in China where that same kind of thing happened. But you see this mass exodus of people, whether it's because of disdain for the people themselves or for land expansion, depends on the reason, but ultimately it's a repeated thing in history that shouldn't be, but sadly still is. So we're going to finish this up. I think it's almost over, actually. Yeah. I'll pause it there, because I don't need anything else on that. He's just finishing up. We'll get to Jeopardy here in just a minute. Alright, so while we have time, let's turn the lights on. Let's discuss this a bit. How do we feel about this event?
It's really interesting to hear about all the like Indian stories, mostly because like my family has just a little bit of Indian in them. And
I think we all do. Everyone's like, I'm 124th Cherokee. Like,
well, my dad always talks about how we always have a little bit of Indian in him, so I always related to that. But it's really cool to hear all these stories about it, and it's interesting how the American people still acknowledge like the Indians, even though they kicked them out.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting how that happens, but it's interesting.
It's interesting. Well, what's cool is you can still go to some reservations today. There are reservations in the state of Georgia. I don't think there are too many Cherokee ones. I think there's like a Creek one. There's plenty of reservations out in Oklahoma. They're still there. The Cherokee have actually thrived there. You've probably seen casinos all around places. That's one way that the Native Americans actually flourished, is they got into the casino business and made money off that. That being said, obviously they never quite grew back to what they used to be. I mean, they were very numerous at one time. Sort of like the buffalo. I mean, there was at one point you could see plains in Buffalo that would just be like go miles and miles and miles long, and it seemed like a sea of endless herds. And the white man came in, and we realized, oh, furs get money, so we're going to kill a lot of them. There's a really sad scene from a movie called Dance of the Wolves. It's a very famous film. And there's one scene where literally the Indians come upon this slope, and it's just bodies of buffalo, just skin. Bodies and bodies and bodies, just skin. The meat wasn't taken, none of it was taken, just the fur. and they would literally just almost exterminate the buffalo race. Now, luckily that's coming back. They're doing that now, so you can still go to Ted to get a bison burger. So, oh wait, that's probably bad taste now. But they are coming back. But just while you could say that the European nations that colonized did a lot of amazing things in their expansions and grew and we flourished at some amazing historical things, but for every amazing historical thing we did, you could also agree there was a lot of negative things we did. And that's kind of the tragedy of American history is we love to not personally ignore it, but like as a nation, we love to kind of ignore it and like don't talk about it. But when we get into the classrooms, when we discuss these things, you have to realize this is our history and we've got to acknowledge it. You know, we've got to understand that is something we share. Luckily, we have moved on from that in a lot of ways in the sense that obviously we see that as wrong, we see it as bad. Sadly, there are still nations out there that still pursue this kind of way of life, you know, slavery and extermination. And hopefully that will not happen for too long. But all right, so we're gonna do, let's see, we got two. I'll let you join in if you want to pick a team. So it looks like you've already got a team. So I know this is gonna be a little bit unfair, but technically she's not in the class, so maybe she doesn't know anything. All right, so we're gonna cover our week 4 Jeopardy. Let me see real quick what our time is. Yeah, we got plenty of time, so we're gonna get through this. And like I said, if we get through this, we'll watch the John Adams video at the very end, but let's go ahead and do this. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to spend time naming the teams. We'll just call this Team 1, Team 2, Team 3. So we'll let Team 1 go first. Go ahead. You know the rules. You're going to pick a category and the points, and then you must raise your hand in order for you to be able to answer the question, or you do not get the points. If you answer it incorrectly, you can lose points. So,
the scores are all wonky.
Oh, sorry. This is the last time I played it. Let's move it back. I just really don't like Team 3, so I feel like we should just start them off at -5. No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. So, alright, so Team 1, go ahead and pick one.
True or false? 200.
200? Alright, true or false 200. Thomas Jefferson's expensive taste had the effect of interfering with his principles on occasion, particularly regarding slavery. Remember, anyone can raise their hand.
True.
Yes, true. That is very true. So this is one of the sad things about our history is our founding fathers, who were arguably great men, were not perfect men. And Jefferson and Washington both owned slaves. So it did happen, yes.
Was it Thomas Jefferson was also saying he was a
Gambler? He might have been. Off the top of my head, I don't remember actually. I know Franklin was. Franklin was. Yeah, Franklin was very promiscuous. He had a lot of vices. Okay, so Team 2, your pick.
Sure.
Okay. Though slaves could not vote or otherwise take part in the political process, their mere presence in the country gave the southern states an extra 21 electoral votes thanks to the 3/5 compromise.
True.
Oh, I got an answer.
Yeah.
I know, I was like,
so this is actually one of the sad and sneaky ways that the South used to gain electoral votes, because what are electoral votes based on?
Population.
Population. So the slaves did not get a vote. They did not get to have a vote, but because they're part of the population, which by proxy mean you had to say that they were what? People. Yeah, that was a really sneaky thing they did. They were like, well, they're not people, but they're part of the population, which means people. So we're going to vote for them, and we get those extra 21 electoral votes. Yeah, that actually happened. It was another really sad part of our history. Okay, all right, Team 3, you get to pick.
Let's do true, false, 400.
Nobody wants to go to the other categories? Alright. The purchase of Louisiana demonstrates how quickly even a strict constructionist could abandon his principles if something stood between the United States and its manifest destiny.
True.
See. In this case, yeah. Not a hard
Disgusting.
Hey,
Abby stole our 500 points.
I know.
Then we need to do Abby.
Alright, Team 2.
You Abby. How many famous Americans 3?
Alright, famous Americans 300. Alright. Peace or war was the main issue surrounding this man's presidency. We've definitely talked about it before.
What is
we get a penalty?
Do we
for
lose
that?
points?
Yeah.
Never mind.
Is this team one?
Yes.
You never got to my point where
Did you go?
No, we answered for you.
Oh, that's, yeah, you never actually got
Yeah.
That's what it is. We did say so you actually need to.
So does everyone want to skip this one? Okay, so this is John Adams.
I said George.
John Adams tried his very, he did not want to get into another war because he was only the second president and they just got out of war, so he was trying to avoid war at all costs, and a lot of presidents go through that period where they try to, sometimes they get pulled into it anyway. Alrighty, so team, I'm gonna mix it up, team one, which I'll pick. Action Events 200. William Congreve developed a rocket within a range of 2 miles, which was used fighting this conflict.
The War of 1812.
The War of 1812. Very good. And the funny thing about this is, when it says rocket, this is not like a rocket, like a big rocket we think today. These were like little tiny rockets that made a lot of noise. It was basically fireworks. That's what they were used. That's how they were used. Yep. So, and the one use of this is it did cause a distraction. So.
So what we think of rockets is not what it was then.
Not back then. Nope.
Now rockets are
Yeah, we think of a rocket as like a big old spaceship thing going up into space, but back then rockets were just literally their fireworks, that's what they were, basically. So now we did improve our rockets a little bit more, and they became a little bit more devastating. But ultimately, we realized that there were better ways to make explosives for war, such as grenades or artillery. Okay, so team 3 got that right. So.
Oh, you guys are good at that. Great, you did do it. I don't know, we did. Let's do famous Americans 500.
Famous, oh man, going for the big score. Okay. He was the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835, and the force behind Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch versus Merriman. It's a tougher one, but actually he's very famous. But it is a tougher one. Probably one of the most famous Chief Justices ever to exist in U.S. history.
I feel like I know it.
I am betting you've heard the name.
Have you read it in our reading yet?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he mentions it.
Okay. Yeah.
I remember reading
Let me put it this way. If you did the reading for this week, he definitely mentions it. These are all taken from the book.
What's his name? Is it a complicated name?
It's actually a pretty simple name.
It's probably John or something.
No, it's not. It's just
James, Jeffrey.
No, I lost it. Hang on. It was like a 3-letter last name.
Thomas.
I remember. It was at the first. I might be thinking of the first 3.
I have no idea.
I'll give you 10 seconds on this one, if you want to try it for it.
I think we've already lost it.
Yeah,
To be honest, we don't.
It's so funny you said 3 last name, but it was close. It was John.
No,
There was John Jay and John Marshall and John Marshall.
Yeah, John Jay. That's what I was thinking of.
John Jay, John Marshall. But John Marshall in this
But you
case.
guys were correct.
Yeah, John was the right one. So if you ever think Supreme Court, just think John. It's John something. So, alrighty. So, nobody got that right. Okay, so team 2, I'll let y'all pick one now.
True or false?
Sure.
Okay, true or false 300? John Marshall thought that the Constitution was a fixed document with set limits, which could only be changed by formal amendments. Yes, correct. Alrighty, very good. Team 2, it's your go.
What did you grab back? 300?
Sure.
Alright, grab that 300. This southern Indian tribe met defeat at the hands of Andrew Jackson with the help of Cherokee allies.
I think I know this, but I don't want to get it wrong.
I thought Team 1
guess, because they have
zero
points.
I'm scared to guess because I don't want to get negative points.
Well, you guys are already losing. You're already losing. It's not going to make one out to the difference.
Hey, negative 300 is worse than 0. Gonna be honest.
Just be Greek. Greek.
I can say that. Southern Indian tribe.
I'm surprised you aren't guessing a very obvious one.
Yeah, I mean,
It's
I have
obvious.
like 3 I could guess, but I'm like not sure if any of
Oh,
them
I
are
guess
right.
I guess because we're
That's what I'm thinking, but I don't like saying it. No, I don't.
It's
I don't
obvious,
like
right?
it, but just totally. You say it.
I don't want to say it.
Oh, go for it, be bold.
No.
Yes.
Is it the creepy?
Gracie, I told you not to say it.
I'm actually surprised y'all didn't go for that because we literally just got done. If there's one tribe that the Cherokee was always at war with, it was the Creek Indians. Actually, fun is
like, did you say the Greek? I was like, no.
not the Greeks. No, it was a different war. Fun fact, by the way, to this day in Georgia, there's a place called Blood Mountain. So it's up toward Vogel State Park. That was actually named from a Creek massacre by the Cherokee. So a lot of people think it was a Civil War thing, Revolution. No, it was actually a Native American thing. So you can still hike up Blood Mountain. So there's some pretty cool history there.
I've heard it's a very strenuous hike.
So it is very strenuous. It's like, you know, it's up. So, and there's a lot of easy ways to get lost. Okay, so Team 3 got that one right.
Let's do acts and events 500.
Okay, acts and events 500. This was the name of the diplomatic fiasco during the Adams presidency where the French demanded a bribe from American negotiators. It was a big scandal.
Did we talk about this? I don't remember.
Not in class, it's definitely in the books.
Okay.
It was a very big scandal.
So we all just don't know this.
Oh, they
The XYZ affair or the Examine Your Zipper affair.
Yeah.
You should look that one up. That was, in case everyone thinks that, oh, scandals have only been around since, you know, Kennedy or something, or Nixon. No, scandals have plagued every single president at some time or another. That's just how part of the deal. Okay, so, except for Harrison, because he died really quick. He didn't have time to have a scandal. He was like, I think he died in less than a month. Okay, so, Team 1, I'll give you all that.
Lecture 400.
Yep. Lecture 400. It is possible to prove that all of America's founders were Christians and therefore the nation is too.
False.
False. You got it first, yep.
I said it. You had to say
And
it.
that is again a common misconception is a lot of people do assume, especially in the Christian community, assume that the founding fathers were Christians.
No.
There were a few that were. I think John Adams was a Christian, but Jefferson was a deist, which is it's not really Christian, maybe. Washington, I think, was a deist. Ben Franklin was an atheist. Not hard atheist like what you see today. So what?
Washington?
He was a deist, yep. Ben Franklin was an atheist, which is not what you see today. People think atheist meant they just didn't believe in God. No, Ben was more of like what you call an agnostic. He believed in the idea of Christian Judeo values. He just didn't necessarily believe directly in Christianity. He was kind of like, there's something there, but he didn't know what to call it, so, yeah. Alright, team, let's see, who got that? Team 2, right? So team 2. It was really close between team 2 and team 3.
If I want to try acts and events 100.
Acts and events for what?
400.
400? This is the name of the doctrine that Jefferson and Madison put by implication into the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Very famous doctrine. Three people on this team. No way.
Oh my gosh. There's a book in my mind. I have to like read it. There's like a book and the name of the word. Back of my mind.
The Virginia Compromise.
Let's see.
If that's not it,
Why is it wrong?
Take this one.
Nullification. Yeah, nullification. So.
that makes me mad, bro.
Alright.
I was so sure, right?
Let's mix it up. Team 1, we'll give you a good because
It's fine.
we're trying to give you all hope here.
I think we're doing fine. I mean,
That's not negative.
Lecture 300.
300? Lecture 300? Okay. A nation that is ruled directly by God through priests exercising political power is called a this. Think of your Latin. Actually, I'm sorry, not your Latin. Think of your Greek.
I don't know the word for it, but I remember listening about it. That house.
No, it doesn't.
misconception that
Yeah, no, I didn't do it.
Christian circles tend to believe that we started this way. We really never did. We pushed separation of church and state for a long time.
I say skip back in
So skip. Okay. This is called a theocracy. Theocracy.
Okay, I know this is.
All right. T1, I'll let you begin again.
True or false, what happened?
French Canadians had nothing in common with British war aims in the Napoleonic Wars, and so could be expected to quickly throw in with the Americans. Based on the video we just watched, no, they had no interest.
You have to raise your hand if I thought
I'm saying it multiple times, so you gotta listen to me. You gotta raise your hand. Yep. Yep. Okay, so, team 2, it's your go. Alright, Woodrow Wilson said that of this man that he was a very great man, but not a great American.
Oh, I don't know. I'm a great name. Oh my gosh, I'm horrible with names.
And that's rich coming from Woodrow Wilson. Not a great president. He was arguably directly responsible for the Vietnam War. True story.
This was a question. A lot, but. No, yeah, I know that names are not.
Crap, I forgot the name.
About 0.
I don't know.
Skip.
You want to skip? You want to skip? Skip?
Yeah, I'll skip.
Let's skip. Okay. So Alexander Hamilton. Part of the reason this was quoted was he was a great man. Arguably, Hamilton gave us a lot of things that actually made us American today, but he was ultimately kind of an imperialist. He always had this notion of being British and going back to that system. So, he was a great treasurer, though. Okay, we'll do, I think, a couple more, and then we'll watch well, maybe 2 or 3 more, and then we'll watch that scene. All right, so give me another one. Team 3, you pick one.
Let's do grab bag 500.
Grab back 500. Gotta go big, right? Alexander Hamilton is to this man like factories are to farming.
I can skip.
No, I know who it is.
Was it,
Oh, this is gonna make me so
Yes.
mad if I didn't think of it.
John Adams?
No.
So close. So close. That was Jefferson. That was a good guess. That was a good guess, but I had to take it. It was Thomas Jefferson.
I can do it.
They were both fighting opposites, but they were both useful and necessary in the founding of the country. So that's the way to think of it. Is they were both complete opposites, but very useful. All right. So team 1, I'll let you pick. Maybe you can get back.
Let's hear one at 500.
Lecture 500. According to the lecture, the best way to think of this founding father is simply human. I'll let her go because she raised her hand.
I want to say George Washington.
Let's see. Thomas Jefferson. To be fair, you only got 2 wrong, so the negative 1,000 shouldn't be, but. Alright, team 2, I'm going to let you pick the final question.
You grab back one.
Sure.
Might as well go big.
Grab back corner. This affair led to Jefferson's resignation as Secretary of State.
He did
He falls asleep.
Who
Who did he fall asleep with, bro? Or no, someone told him that.
We won't let them get out, so we in second place.
So is it the XYZ up there?
So what? You raise your hand?
Yeah. Oh.
Citizen Jeff.
We're second place anyway.
We're still in second place now.
That's
So I think it's fair to say Team 2 won this particular bout. We'll see what happens next week. Remember to get your readings and highlight stuff so you remember stuff for Jeopardy. Alrighty. Cool. Alright, we're gonna go ahead and turn the camera off and we'll watch the scene. So.
Well, I'm actually excited about it. Because I think we've watched